Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. Thank you for joining us yet again. We have got a lot going on in the weeks and months to come, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. This episode, Damien Walter is with us again. Damien has talked with us before, so definitely go back and check out that episode from earlier this year where Damien joins us. Damien is the host of Science Fiction, the podcast, which is a fantastic podcast. He gives writing courses. You can check out his website. We're going to have that in the show notes, so definitely look into that. So we're super happy to have Damien back yet again. In the weeks to come, months to come, we've got a lot going on. Adrian Tchaikovsky is back on the show again, so he'll be talking to us in the next few weeks. Charlie Jane Anders, we've got Peter Watts and Carl Schrader. We'd like to consider Peter and Carl friends of the show. We've met up with them in Toronto for some panels that we did at Fan Expo last year, and we saw Carl again this past summer. We've also got Kim Stanley Robinson joining us in the new year. And then in the spring, Martha Wells is coming on the show. Martha Wells, I mean, we're talking about Murderbot in this, in the episode after the one you're listening to right now, so that'll be out next week. Also worth mentioning, we're going to be bringing over a new concept show where we are doing complete trivia episodes with celebrities. So sometimes actors, sometimes other podcasters, sometimes filmmakers. We have Cory Doctorow and Shauna McGuire joining us on that trivia episode. So they're going to be hanging out doing trivia together, but also we get to hear about what they're up to next. Then we've got some other episodes. Dominic Monaghan, Robert Duncan McNeil from Star Trek Voyager and the Delta Flyers podcast will be in another episode. And we've got a lot of other actors who'll be joining us in those episodes, which will be called Trivia from the Bridge. You'll be able to see our regular episodes where we talk about books. You're going to be able to see the episodes where we're doing trivia. So just check out the titles, but we're going to be coming out with a lot more content because we're super excited to be together talking about sci-fi, talking about writing, talking about film, talking about so many cool stuff that you like to listen to as well. So again, thank you. Please rate the show. Email us, follow us on Twitter. We've got a Facebook group that's quite active. Every day we're talking about stuff on there. So on Facebook, Tales from the Bridge, just find us. You will find us easily. Join the conversation. Let us know what you like about the show. Leave us ratings wherever you listen to podcasts. We want to really grow here, and we want to grow with you, our listeners. We're so thankful that you've been joining us almost a year and a half of doing the show, and we're so happy to be doing it. We want to keep doing it. Thank you again. All right, Damien is waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
We have with us again today Damien Walter, a friend of the show. He has online courses in writing. I've listened to your Rhetoric of Story course, which I thought was quite amazing. And then this year you've put out the Advanced Science Fiction and Fantasy Writing course, I think it's called. It's writing the 21st century myth, which is amazing. And I actually just listened to your last episode of that, which was an amazing overview of everything you said in in the first season of the Science Fiction podcast. So thanks for being on here, and thanks for listening to our show, at least enough to have taken us to task publicly on not adequately appreciating Iain M. Banks. So we're going to have that conversation as part of what we talk about today, and we'll talk about whatever else comes up. But I think this is a good anchor for us to basically focus on the question of what is good writing and what is bad writing, which is something that we've been talking a lot about, and you've been talking a lot about, and is much on people's minds with what's been going on in the science fiction and fantasy television universe these days. So, welcome, Damien.
Thank you, Marty, Kevin, Sam, Tristan. Yeah, good to speak with you guys again. I think listening to your podcast where you were talking about the player of games, and it's one of my personal favorite science fiction novels. I wouldn't say I have just one that I love above all others, but it was a little bit like you were hating the thing that I love. So I understood actually how other people feel when I criticize their stuff there for a moment. Yeah, you see, because I am very critical in my take on science fiction. I want to take stuff apart and understand it. And you were doing that really well with that book. I mean, your criticisms were totally valid. I guess the one thing to say about Iain M. Banks, Banksy, a lot of the people who knew him called him as well. I didn't know him personally. I had chatted with him a couple of times at conventions and stuff. Is that For British science fiction fandom, he was like one of ours. He was originally a science fiction writer, but he couldn't get those books published straight away, and so he did the audacious thing. He went and wrote literary fiction. And won at that game his first, I think, 4 or 5 novels, are big literary fiction novels. And then he started publishing his science fiction novels. So it was like one of our tribe had gone over to Mordor and become Sauron and stolen the Ring of Power. And then he came back and wrote great science fiction novels as well. So he's really important to British science fiction fandom. I think I could call him like the best writer to come out of science fiction in that generation. And the science fiction novels are great as well. So I'll try not to get too defensive of anyone who isn't as huge a fan of Iain M. Banks as I am.
Well, let's also be clear here. Kevin and myself, huge fans. We've read, Kevin's read almost all of them, if not all of the Culture novels.
Several times.
I believe. And Kevin introduced me, and Accession was my first, and I loved it right away. And I'm reading 2 a year basically at this point for the past 3 years, and then we've got these two shit disturbers here, Sam and Marty, who I have started a ruckus here.
Yeah, I may refer to you, but I can't make any promises for Sam. Yeah.
I'll be polite, I promise. Though, to be fair, I mean, I did refer to the player games as Bobby Fischer in space, which maybe was not kind. But
I think that's fair and true, though. You could also call it The Hobbit in space.
Yes.
It's one of those. There's a whole bunch of like English children's stories like Wind in the Willows and The Hobbit that you have a kind of well-educated, upper-class Englishman in his home or his hole, and a wizardy type character comes along, or a drone in the case of player games, and whips him off on an adventure. And I think Iain Banks always had these very classic structures in the sci-fi stories, like consider Phlebas. I hadn't thought about this at all, and he said at a convention event some years ago, consider Phlebas is a pirate story in space. You have all of the elements of a pirate story. It's a pirate ship. They're going to a secret island. It's defended by a magical dragon creature. And he was always surprised that people just didn't notice that about the story. And nobody in the audience had really thought about it either. And I think most of the books, until you get on a bit further, something like Look to Windward, I don't think it has that simpler structure underlying it, and that's one of the reasons I like that book so much as well. So you can always see there's like a simple story, Bobby Fischer in space there, but then there's lots of other stuff woven around it as well.
Yeah, it's a richly crafted section of space for sure. And I think that's where what I liked about him was his world building, but I felt that got the attention, and that the pace and the style is where I felt it became a slog for me, where I was really sort of struggled. I sort of took it like his style as something that reminded me of like J.D. Salinger. Like, it was almost a meditative approach. Perhaps like KSR, there are some places where perhaps they would benefit greatly from a sort of collaborative effort, with another writer to sort of flesh out the plot and balance out those sort of two elements to the book.
Well, I think there's a difference between
people do that.
there's quite a difference between often British and European readers' responses to Iain M. Banks and American and Canadian. I don't want to lump you all together into one former colonial group, but there was something happening but I will, there's something happening that Iain M. Banks was definitely a very, very big part of, which I'm going to do a big video essay on this at some point. So I'm thinking about it a lot at the moment, which I call like the British deconstruction of sci-fi, that sometime around the 1960s. Because, of course, Britain and America can share lots of cultural stuff. We speak the same language, kind of. And so things can move between, but there's certain American science fiction writers that just don't work in Britain. And there's certain British science fiction writers that for some American readers, especially in a field like space opera, don't work very well. And I think Iain Banks is one of those, partly because you do have a kind of, there's usually a climax to the stories, but it's not really about the space battles or the commanders building up for those battles or the strategies in space that quite a lot of more American space opera is about, and the kind of beats and tempos of that. So that isn't really in a book like Player of Games. And I think for people who are turning up with that expectation for the genre of space opera, it's not going to be very pleasing for them. And then when you start with Iain M. Banks, if you start with a book like Consider Phlebas, that's just taking a lot of the ideas of space opera that were popular when he was writing. So he has a secret agent in there, but the secret agent's mission is completely pointless. It doesn't actually have any impact on even in the overall war that they're fighting. And he's actually a really dislikable character as well. I mean, you can empathize with him, but he's really a bit of an arsehole. He makes terrible, selfish decisions, and he's on the wrong side of the war. So I think all of these kind of ideas are, for a lot of readers with that American expectation, they come in and go, what the hell is this thing? But that was very much what Banks was shooting for, and his whole generation of writers had this kind of studied kind of punk contempt for what Americans were doing with sci-fi. I've had Alan Moore in my mind, and I did a video about him this week, which is getting shouted at a lot on YouTube. And I met him at a UK convention. And just said to him, there was this short story of yours that I read, and I really enjoyed it. And he said, oh, yeah, someone invited me to write a fantasy story. And I thought, why the fuck would I write a fantasy story? So I just made the fun of fantasy as much as I could. And that's a very British position, that the genres are there to be taken apart, made fun of, used as fuel for something else. But I don't think a lot of like the core readership of sci-fi and fantasy don't necessarily enjoy that part of the British deconstruction of it.
Well, there's something there, because I was into sci-fi fairly significantly, and then I moved to London, England, and I remember going into the Tube and seeing big ads for Iain M. Banks books. I can't remember which books were coming out at that point. This would have been 2005, and I remember saying, "Who's this guy?" And so I read one of his books. I went to the library, took out one of his books, and I loved it. And the reason I loved it was because of the culture and just the idea of it. And we have to take us back to that time, like in particular in the early 90s in particular. I think it was some of the best stuff out there when, in hindsight, for me, looking back, it was really good. And then we started to get kind of more out there and different worlds, and for me, I like the techno utopias. I really like this idea that humans are part of this large group that is really doesn't have to worry technologically most of the time. There's something satisfying about it, and so at the time, it really scratched an itch that I think a lot of sci-fi authors were looking for. But you're right that I had never heard about them never heard of him living in Canada until I came to the UK, where I would see big ads for him in the Tube, right? So, difference in the popular culture.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. Like, you've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Yeah, he was a huge seller, and it was a time when science fiction was selling a lot as well. That was probably the peak of the commercial success of science fiction book sales. So writers were getting six-figure advances. Iain M. Banks was buying sports cars and crashing them on the profits of his sci-fi books. I don't think there's anyone out there doing that with their sci-fi sales today, because there's so much more competition, especially in video games, that desire to get absorbed into a world. If you look at Iain Banks was accused of stealing the idea for the orbital from Larry Niven's Ringworld books, and clearly Larry Niven did that first. He did the superstructure thing, but he does them a little bit differently. And then it's Iain Banks's orbitals that become the inspiration for Halo, and that's most people's idea of what a Ringworld type thing is now. And most people probably explore them through video games now, so that peak is gone. But Iain Banks also was very knowledgeable and had a real critical understanding of the genre. So he's doing something quite specific in the culture books, which I think is, you don't need to know that there's this history there, that he was this kid growing up reading all of these books like Asimov's Foundation. And that's a really important book for space opera. Of course, you have lots of stuff like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon before it. But they don't take it very seriously. They're not at all intellectual about what space opera is. And then you have John W. Campbell, the great American editor, and he says to the young Asimov, we're doing science fiction that is serious. Now, I want real ideas. So Asimov pitches him this idea that he's going to do a space opera, which is about the collapse and rise of a galactic civilization. And from that, you get Foundation. So I think that's really the first kind of serious high concept space opera. And because of Foundation, you get the Federation as well. You get Star Trek. So you have this whole line of intellectual thought about what's the future of humanity, but more about the future of our civilizations. What are we evolving towards? So Foundation is kind of about the rise and fall of a scientific civilization. The Federation is thinking about a lot of the same stuff. Things like the baddies, the Klingons and the Romulans are clearly like different political models. The Romulans are the bad communists, or maybe that's the Klingons, how you see them. And Banks is taking on a lot of this stuff, and he puts this into the culture novels. And the culture is like the final extrapolation of what human civilization could be. It's technology has given us a pure utopia. If you're a citizen of the culture, your life is absolutely amazing. You're effectively immortal. You can be reincarnated into new bodies. You can live as any kind of creature you want to. But then how do you tell a story about this? So Banks does two things. He shows you the kind of the gritty life for people in the galaxy outside that. And he shows you, what does the culture do? Well, if you're kind of bored of living in utopia, you go and mess around with alien civilizations. You find some backwards-looking kind of capitalist, evil, exploitative civilization, and you go and undermine them and turn them into a utopia as well. And that's the game for the people of the culture. And I don't think you had to follow any of that progression of what space opera was becoming to enjoy them as a reader necessarily. But Banks was definitely thinking about all of that stuff. So he was both deconstructing that genre and advancing it at the same time. So I'd say he was a real artist of science fiction, and in quite a small group of writers who were working that way.
We spoke to Charlie Strauss, another British author, and he was discussing Iain, and I guess he knew him personally, and he said that he was quite a political thinker, and in fact that politics informed his work fairly significantly. And you look at the techno utopia of the culture, and certainly that is one viewpoint of the future. Kind of like Sue Burke's, what's the name of her universe? But similar ideas in terms of you have what you need. Everything is provided for you, right? And that's and you're right about capitalist baddies that become something that should be improved upon. And that's a viewpoint, right? And that is a political viewpoint, and obviously that speaks to his viewpoints.
I think it's historically relevant, right? During the time he was writing, we had the war in Yugoslavia, right? And this is the West, right? The technological West going in to fix, a society that's gone wrong and the dangers that comes with. So that's what Look to Windward is very much about, right? Is the futzing, right, with some other less advanced society and accidentally causing a civil war. Well, that's happened a few times in history, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to go back to what you said there about and consider Phlebas. There's this spy whose mission turns out to be entirely pointless. And I remember reading that like 10 years ago, and that just pissed me off. I was like, I can't believe I spent all this time reading about this guy, and I hate him, and everything he did is totally pointless. Well, that's also, what happened in Look to Windward. At least at the end, right? There's all this like bizarre way that he puts together a scene right on this world, and there's some, the bad guys are training there, and then later, somebody discovers a spy strapped to the wall and tells them that this bad thing's going to happen, and this guy goes, and then it turns out, the whole story is resolved without any of that plot, and it was all pointless. But I get it, right? Like what you're saying, this is he's poking his finger in our eye, right? With the genre and the tropes, and some people enjoy that, I guess, more than I do. But I think it's amazing that you just made that connection for me, because the quote at the beginning of Look to Windward is, "Gentile or Jew, oh you who turned the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you." So that's from T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. And I was like, oh my God, there's clearly, some connection to his first book from this book. And well, I guess that's one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the unofficial sequel to Consider Phlebas. And I think it brackets.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. Because the mind at the heart of that story that is running the world is one of the minds who's involved with the war like 800 years earlier, I think. And it's the light from the exploding star that has arrived somewhere else in the galaxy 800 years later, connecting those points. And in the structure of the culture novels as well, I think that Look to Windward is the last really great one for me. I think there are 10 overall. And the last one, the Hydrogen Sonata, is also good, but there was a level where Banks was maybe kind of punching above his weight or anybody else's weight when he was doing these books that were they were very high concept science fiction. So one of the reasons he minimizes the plots is he really wants to work with concepts and with themes. So Look to Windward, he's really doing his biggest thematic work. So he's kind of like the composer character in there. He's composing all of these elements around his central theme, which in Look to Windward is death, basically. It's what do you do with the experience of death? And as he's been playing with the culture, he has these characters who can, if they want to, live forever. But what he starts thinking about, I think, is, where the ways that technology is not going to save humans, that it can make everything materially perfectly fine for us. But we still suffer with things like loneliness and isolation and broken hearts. And do you actually want to live as a human being for 800 or 1,000 or 3,000 years? Some of his characters have stayed alive that long. So a number of times in a number of the books, and Look to Windward is one of these, he has characters choose to actually die. And Banks is, I'm pretty sure he was an atheist. He was definitely, a materialist in his outlook at the world. But he starts struggling with these ideas in the later books of the Culture series of the materialist view can't really take into account for. So what does happen when you die? He has the idea of subliming. So there are races who've gone to some other dimension beyond material existence. But he really starts thinking about death as a serious theme. And that's what everything in Look to Windward is kind of orchestrated around. So really the whole book is about that moment at the end where you have I forget the name of the alien species, but they're like cat-like beings, kind of evolved from tigers or something. And you have the Major who's been grieving for his lost lover all the way through the book. And so he's going on this revenge suicide mission, which is like a very clear call to kind of Islamic terrorism, 9/11 type stuff. And you had this mind, super intelligent AI that has been alive for thousands of years and has just constantly seen human beings dying the whole time, sometimes in terrifying accidents. And they both decide at the same time that they're actually going to die. They're going to go on. Sorry, spoiler alert for anyone who hadn't seen it there. And
the plot doesn't matter in any of these books.
No, not really. And that's what I find beautiful about the book. There's a very small number of science fiction novels that have that kind of thematic resonance built in. I think Neuromancer, William Gibson is one. Ursula Le Guin is another who could do it, but there's not many out there. And they're mostly British or Canadian, not American. But
Well, I will say there were 3 pages in this 350-page book that were quite sublime and excellent and made the whole thing worth reading. And that is exactly where this mind describes not only that it has seen so many humans die, but I guess in the war, right, 800 years ago, it was responsible for having to kill or destroy 3 orbitals. And a certain number of humans, that didn't leave. And then it recorded each of those deaths in great detail and watched it and took responsibility for it. And, it's this extremely moral and ethical sort of superhuman position, right, that is suddenly described by this mind just before it decides. Well, first of all, that gave it the legitimacy or the legitimacy, maybe the ability to now be responsible for 50 billion lives in this orbital, right? That it has this value of human life from having seen how terrible death can be, and then also decides to die itself. I'm not sure if I'm using the right pronouns. I think they're its. The minds.
Let's not get into the pronoun argument.
Yes. But yeah, that was actually, worth the entire book for me. It was quite an extraordinary, like you say, a meditation on death, which is serious, yeah, and it elevates this to literature, which is always what I'm looking for. But yes, the style sort of gets to me. But now, I can appreciate that actually, the pointlessness of such a far future civilization, the nihilism, right? That highlights exactly what you're saying, that it's not about the plot. It's not about, getting to eat the best food or having the best car or any of that stuff, that there are these eternal problems that transcend all that, that will still be left there for humanity to solve.
He could almost be writing like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at times, which of course, billions of people love and find hilarious. But some people really hate that book. Like Brandon Sanderson hates Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. When I've seen him talk about it, he said it doesn't have characters. It's not funny at all. And it's at an opposite end of a spectrum of prose fiction that Brandon Sanderson is at another end of. And sometimes it's about being able to hear the voice. So like the audiobooks of Iain M. Banks, I sometimes recommend them to people who said they don't like it, because I think it's Peter Kenny who reads them, and he captures the character voices and he captures the kind of ironic humorousness of a lot of the passages, because Banks as well is like hilariously funny. If you saw him do live events, people would be in stitches for 60 minutes. He was like a sci-fi stand-up comic. So his events were always packed out at UK conventions. But he kind of made the decision to not just be a comedy writer. So he could have been like a Terry Pratchett. He could easily have written that kind of very ironic, satirical material. I mean, I don't know, he could easily have done it, but it was there. But he wanted to get to these more dramatic notes. So he's often restraining his humor, but he will slip a lot of humor into the characterizations there as well. But I think sometimes it helps to hear the voice. Like I find Brandon Sanderson, when I try and read him, somewhat unreadable. But then when I listen to the audiobooks, I'm like, oh, okay, I get this now. The reader has given me the very high fantasy tone that you're supposed to be hearing when Brandon is writing. And I think that's another kind of, can be a cultural divide as well, in the voice that we hear when we pick something up and read it off the paper.
Well, a question I have for you, Damien, is like, who do you consider to be Ian's children? Like, who's writing today that you think is writing from Banks's shoulders?
That's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it. There's quite a shift which has happened in science fiction. So Ian's big decade is the 90s and the early noughties, and then I would say, to add some critique, that he goes a little bit off the boil. He's writing a lot of books very quickly, at least 2 books a year. He starts kind of like eating his own back catalogue in a sense, and you see, this is another smart talking young woman with a high sex drive, and this is one of the things I've often not enjoyed about Banks is his use of torture scenes. I wrote an essay on this at some point, and it's kind of a bad habit, actually, of that British deconstruction scene, that they tend to think that because they're kind of deconstructing sci-fi, that adding these like very extremely violent scenes or very sadistic scenes, which I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I find it tremendously difficult to read things that are very sadistic. I just find it very off-putting. So there's actually a Banks book, The Algebraist, that I'd never read, because it starts with this very sadistic idea that the villain is using, and I just stopped reading at that point, and I've never gone back to it. So there's some critique of one of my favorite writers as well. But he also, like we were saying, that, this was the peak commercially for science fiction. We've gone through a very major shift of what science fiction is doing. I think a major symbol of that has been a kind of new diversity in science fiction. Like one of the flaws of that British deconstruction movement is that it was very white. It was very British and American and very male generally as well. And this one very specific culture kind of feeding on itself and looking back on its own ideas. And the important shift kind of post-2010, and you can see it in things like the Hugo Awards, is lots of different cultures coming into science fiction and bringing their ideas. So a writer like... Finally. A writer like Anne Leckie, not from a different cultural background, really, but, I don't want to call her one of Iain M. Banks's children, because she's really looking at Banks and saying, well, there's a lot here that I don't like. There's a lot that I do, but there's a lot that I don't like about this. So I'm going to take some of these ideas and deconstruct them myself. So someone like Leckie is... I would say after Banks, she's one of the major contributors to space opera. But she's not like honoring Iain M. Banks. She's taking some of the stuff that she liked in the way that he did and then advancing it.
Yeah, I think I also like Arcady Martin comes to mind as well.
Yeah.
It's space opera. It's not all lasers, and I mean, you get into a bit of that, but it's more of it's diplomacy and government workings and changing of power and these sort of big political processes sort of at work with the threat of alien invasion sort of in the offing, right? And I thought she did a very good job of that as well. And with that sort of modern take where you don't. The sort of traditions of like, say, 80s or 90s male-centric, straight white guy sci-fi is left behind, and it's a refreshing take. That's the closest I could come to what I was seeing in Banks, where it was a little more. The pacing was slower and a little more. The story's a little more low key, but I was still there. There was enough richness to it that kept me. I didn't feel like I was reading a beeline standing in as the main plot, and I think that's where I struggle with Banks is that I'm waiting for the. I feel like I'm still in the first 2 or 3 chapters when I'm at the last 2 or 3 chapters. And that's, I don't know if that makes sense, but that feeling that there's a lack of launch there, and I'm not, and that's what I keep looking for, and I'm not getting the satisfaction of, and it almost certainly probably comes from my North American lack of subtlety and this need for a handiness, but I think that's where I come to, like, I can't make it. Well, I've never made it to the last 3 chapters of the Banks book, so I don't know that I should be using that as my.
I really liked what Tristan said. Tristan, if you remember, Tristan, you said Banks books are not about the destination; they're about the journey. Oh. And it's the experiencing of the ideas and the concepts and the themes. And I think that is, Marty, you said that it's kind of Zen, right? It's almost like a meditation. You have to sort of relinquish yourself to the fact that the plot is secondary to the ideas. And that's, for me, I've said this before, I'm reading a Banks book, and I'll put it down and I'll stare at the wall and I'll think about that paragraph and say, wow, for him to come up with that paragraph, he must have thought about the way that this society evolved and the kind of sub-themes that emerged from it, and all just to craft that one paragraph. And those ideas are what bring me back to Banks. And it's certainly not the plot.
Yeah, and I don't mean to understate that. Like, when I say he's an incredible world builder, I mean, he creates this lush stage, to be sure. I do want to be clear on my support of that, his ability to do that, and same with Kim Stanley Robinson. It's there's no denying that.
Now, while we're talking about authors that are about the journey and not the destination, we should mention Becky Chambers as well, right? As another newer kind of version of space opera, where again it's sort of about this journey through the characters and different characters than you're used to, and sociology and politics, but there isn't actually much happening. It's a long way to a small angry planet, and you're just sort of on that journey until they get there.
Well, I'm curious to know if Damien, if you can kind of home in on one idea here of I guess, this is going to be really hard to do, but what is good writing? We can be very pragmatic and find the elements that make a good book. So if we were to just look at Banks's work from the 90s and then compare it to the 90s when you had like the Star Wars books, I mean, there was probably a dozen writers who were pumping out this and fleshing out this huge world for Star Wars, and likely sold more books worldwide, likely and could have had more enjoyment and more adventure for the reader. So if we have these books that are written for the Star Wars world, and there's different authors doing it, and the people that the publishers don't really care, they just say, write about this character. They don't care if it all fits. It just doesn't matter. They just want to sell books. But people are enjoying these books. Are they better books? Are they worse books? Where does, if Banks is such a good writer, and I'm on the same page with you here, Damien, I really do think he is, but if he is such a good writer, then why doesn't everyone like his stuff? And how can we figure this out? Because even when it comes to television and movies these days, we can have a great film that's not well received, and we can have not well received films, Marvel, that are very well received. What's going on with that?
I think most Marvel movies, whilst they have some duds, are actually very brilliant at being what they are, as opposed to like DC movies, which fail at trying to be the same thing. And generally people say that didn't work, But the issue for for writing is that books are in this very tense relationship with television and films, of course, televisual media, and now video games as well. So there are some writers who I won't name because I'm not trying to name and shame people, who are like people who have played a lot of video games, and they can't get onto a development team for a game, so they write a book. And you read the book and you're like, well, this is like someone trying to use words to create a video game in a book. And you have quite a long history of this with movies and television as well. So like the Star Wars books that you're talking about, Timothy Zahn. So Timothy Zahn's trilogy, is that the Heir to the Empire trilogy. And it's like the immediate aftermath, and you have Grand Admiral Thrawn, who's generally agreed to be like the best Star Wars character who has never been in the films. And it's kind of foolish that Disney just didn't take that trilogy and film it, because it's also written like a movie script. It's very tight scenes. They're quite short. It's dialogue and a little bit of description of what's happening in the scene. And in each chapter, there's a really good turning point. And if you know your kind of technical screenplay writing, those Timothy Zahn books are a great screenplay in a book. And they're very readable as well. I've read them a number at times. If you really like novels, they're not great novels, though, because they don't really do a lot of the things that novels do. They don't particularly take you inside the characters. And if you're someone who kind of reads a lot of literary fiction, they will seem very flat on the page. Whereas Ian Banks, who I agree probably sold much less than those Timothy Zahn books, if you do read a lot, they still seem very interesting, especially his literary novels. If you go over to stuff like The Bridge or Song of Stone or a number of his other books, he really pushes into voice in the characters. So I think it's Song of Stone. It's just narrated by one kind of very unusual psychology of the character. The Wasp Factory is a similar deal. You're really inside this person's psyche. And I think one of the issues, again, around that 1990s point is that there's a bigger and bigger split, especially in sci-fi, between the people who are essentially very televisual in their thinking, and when they pick up a book, they want all those structures from television and movies, and the people who are still over actually enjoying what prose fiction can do on the page. So somebody like Arkady Martin, who I don't know at all, but I would assume is a very big reader, reads a lot of books. Her books are very enjoyable to other very passionate readers, but I would guess are a little bit less approachable to people who mostly watch television and movies and sometimes pick up a book. And that's quite a divide, and I'm not sure what the answer is. You know, I'm writing, one of the reasons that the science fiction podcast is on a season break at the moment is I'm doing a lot of writing myself, and I'm trying to balance this in what I'm writing, this drive to something that appeals to people who are mostly televisual in the way that we're thinking, which is most people now, but still has interest as kind of prose fiction on the page. And it's not easy to do at all.
So I guess like a Ready Player One would be the perfect televisual, as you put it, book.
Mm-hmm.
Or Robopocalypse, right? Daniel H. Wilson. We've talked to him too, right? And his books are just like a movie going on in your brain, right?
Yeah, I certainly see, building. I for a number of years I was literally like living on top of mountains in Southeast Asia and meditating, and I would look at a phone every 2 weeks, and now I basically stare at a screen like 19 hours a day and then grab some sleep, because what I'm doing professionally at the moment is all about building online community and podcasting and all the research as well. And I see my concentration and ability to read complex prose fiction like going on a downward curve through that process as well. So there's a big open question about what happens to novels generally, and I think science fiction is part of the answer. I think it's not so much that people can't concentrate and because I don't want to say that, I don't want to buy into this whole argument that the internet is just dumbing people down or something. I think it's actually making people much more selective, like the density of the information that they're taking in. So I think I spoke about this writer, Sam Hughes, QNTM, and his prose fiction is just super dense with ideas. He writes episodically, and you take 1,000 words, and there's so much like encoded into it. So I think that we'll probably see a style of writing emerging, which is for like the super intelligent, zero attention span of those of us who are permanently online. I don't know exactly what that style will be, but I can kind of see it emerging at the moment. And it will probably be unreadable to people who are just a few 2 years too old to understand what's going on in there.
That sounds really exciting, though, doesn't it? It sounds like evolution. It sounds like humans taking a step forward. I really like that concept. I hope that happens. As we all hope our children are smarter than us, and if that's the case, then
they're different.
In good hands.
And like with evolution, right? It's not goal oriented. It's not that it's better. It's just that things just keep adjusting to the new context in which they find themselves. I tried reading the mimetic. There is no, what is it?
There is no anti-memetics division. Yeah.
Right. And I found it exactly like you described it, like so dense and so information rich. I gave up twice already. I am going to do it, but as we know, I can read lots of stuff I don't like. but yeah, it's such a different style, and you're right on the head, right? It's for like internet heads, people that are just like immersed in data and information in a different way than the kind of books that I grew up reading.
Yeah, if you're spending all day coding and shitposting on Reddit, then you can go and read QNTM. But if you've still got normal human psychology, you're not going to be in the space for
Yeah. Well, maybe we can take a turn now. We've done a lot of brainy book stuff. It's time to talk about the Rings of Power, Damien. Now that it's finished, now that I'm sure you've seen it till the end, what is your verdict on the objective truth about whether this is terrible or good?
Yeah, I mean, I'm rarely angered by a television production, but I'm angry for quite a specific reason, because obviously I spend like most of my time, like a lot of my time actually forecasting what's going to happen with these TV shows. It's a bit like a magic trick on YouTube or in the sci-fi group. People love to think, is this going to be good? Why is it going to work or not? And then people love to argue back and say, how can you prejudge it? But I was pretty sure that I could prejudge the Rings of Power. Everything in the build-up was just a very bad sign. The two guys who were show running it had no experience. It was this really weird fudge of what did they actually have the rights to make. Like, it's an adaptation of the Silmarillion, but they can't use any of the material from the Silmarillion. So I just started calling it fake Tolkien on the group, which nothing has angered some people as much as that angered some people. But I think...
Oh, I'm still pissed off from that one.
Sorry. But I think it's true. It is like when some factory in Southeast Asia starts churning out like fake iPhones or something. You buy them on wish.com. It's the wish.com version of Tolkien. But then when the first 2 episodes came out, they were actually quite good. I'm going to go back and watch them again at some point and see if I was just being delusional. The first 2 episodes, maybe they'd worked on the script longer. I think maybe they had that script in development some years ago. And they were able to pull that out. It had some kind of interesting thematic links about the elves as like the British upper class and the grief of the First World War. And I was just like, okay, despite my hate for it in the build-up, I'm going to give it a chance. So I did my review of the first 2 episodes and kind of gave it a thumbs up. And then from episode 3 onwards, it's just apologies if anyone here has been enjoying it, but I think it's complete trash. It's badly written. It's not Tolkien in any way, other than the fact that it has some symbols taken from Tolkien. But I was angered by the fact that they snuck past me, because I would have just been consistently condemning of it otherwise. But it was also a bit awkward that, and this is kind of a problem in sci-fi criticism at the moment, which is kind of a growing field. So there's some YouTube critics who mostly look at sci-fi and fantasy stuff, and they have like 3-4 million views for what they're doing. But when you actually go and dig into what they're doing, under the surface, it's a lot of culture war stuff, and they're angry that there's a black hobbit, or there's too many women, or it's a woke thing. So it's very difficult when something is terrible, like Lord of the Rings, but it's also being generally attacked on these culture war issues, which I would like to have no interest in. I'd like to never have to speak about them, but I find myself actually in conflict with some of these YouTube reviewers. So recently on my YouTube channel, I've been doing some rebuttals of their critiques, as much to try and separate myself from them as possible, because I don't like Rings of Power, but it has nothing to do with a Black Dwarf. I'm absolutely happy with blind casting and television, and I don't think that that's an issue at all.
So why is it bad writing? Let's see if we can answer that question. What is bad about the writing in that particular series?
Well, you could take a very technical issue, like you can look at a single scene and say, does this scene have a turning point? Did anything actually happen in this scene? And you can take half of the scenes out of an episode of Rings of Power and nothing happened. There's no change in the plot. Nothing has changed between the characters and their relationship. Nothing internally for any individual character has changed.
So it's Iain M. Banks, is what you're saying. It's exactly like Iain M. Banks.
It's exactly like Iain M. Banks.
Don't bring Ian into this party.
In Banks, something in those scenes would probably have changed internally for the characters. But in Rings of Power, looking as a sometime screenwriter, no, you can't see any changes there. And then, it's entirely plot driven. So the way you end up with a plot driven story is that, like, James Bond is generally plot driven, because you know what's going to happen in the story. He goes on a mission, there's various beats along that mission. You get to a crisis, climax, resolution at the end of the story, and that's fine for James Bond. But then the great James Bond movies like Casino Royale or a few others, they manage to make that character driven. You see James Bond change along the way. And to do what they wanted to do with Rings of Power, it would have to be character driven. If you want to make eight hours of screen time in the Lord of the Rings universe, you can't just have an idea that a volcano is going to explode in hour 7 and just put your characters on rails to that point, which is what they basically did. The problem with doing that is that when you have these set pieces, they work okay. So the volcano explodes, that was pretty good. But whenever your characters stop and speak to each other, until then, they have nothing to say because they're just on rails towards these plot points. So all the times when Galadriel and the Southland King, who is somebody else, won't spoil that for people who haven't seen it, whenever they stop and speak to each other, you just get these kind of really, they just say what's happening in the story because there's nothing else for them to work with as writers. And I think basically it's like watching, I called it the Dunning-Kruger of fantasy writers. It's like a group of writers, some of whom are really skilled. Like there's a writer, I forget her name now, and she's a Breaking Bad writer, and some of her scripts for Breaking Bad are excellent. So some of the writers involved are not bad writers, but I think they made the assumption that writing Tolkien-esque fantasy is easy, when actually it's probably one of the most difficult things to try and do as a storyteller, to make all those elves and dwarfs and talking trees, to make them not ridiculous on the page, to give them the depth that Tolkien managed to give them. That's really hard to do. And to give the writers a break, they didn't have time to do it. They probably wrote those scripts over the space of a few months on an outline that had been agreed in a few writers' room meetings. Took Tolkien 14 years to write the actual Lord of the Rings. Took him his entire life to do all the world building for it. So I think they probably didn't ever have a chance to do it. Nonetheless, quite a few people still enjoyed the show. But I can't give an explanation for what people were enjoying. Marty, you're giving me a look like you did enjoy it. So if that's the case,
Well, I was going to just
why.
pass it to Sam. Sam's going to take you to task on this because he, I think, officially enjoed it the most.
Okay.
I really
of
did.
all of
Yeah,
us.
yeah, I did. I loved it. I watched the early episodes twice. But I'm a guy with a Lord of the Rings tattoo, pre Peter Jackson movies. So for me, an opportunity to go back to that world was a welcome one. And again, where it was a diverse world, an updated world, and we sort of brought it forward, and it didn't need to be perfect for me. It needed to, if it's a launching pad for more, I'm happy to return. So I'm pretty forgiving of it, but I come in with this huge bias, and a couple of the characters captured me just enough that the proto hobbits, Galadriel and the elves in general, and the dwarves. I mean, I was like, yeah, I wanted to see more of all of them, and it was visually stunning, and I liked it because for me, I wasn't necessarily going back to the books for it. I was going back to the Peter Jackson movies, which I thought were a little heavy-handed. Actually, I thought they were a little. I thought his direction on it was a little theatrical for a film, and so for me, this kept me in the world that he had built visually, but I felt that the actors had been better directed and fit my sort of visual imprint of what they should look like and behave and act in a way that was more tuned to my childhood vision of that world.
There's a thing that
hard.
writers go through, like in their development. Do you know Anne Vandermeer? Anne Vandermeer is Jeff Vandermeer's wife, and she was the editor of Weird Tales magazine, and she's a great kind of nurturer of young writers. And something that Anne Vandermeer says, that writing is a long career, and very few people will really emerge into writing before their late 30s or early 40s, really, or well into people's 50s. That might be when they actually start to succeed commercially, for instance. So people have spent years and decades focusing on that. And generally, anyone who is skilled at writing, storytelling, screenplay writing has been through that kind of process. And getting there, I think, is very painful for most people. And one of the things that happened to me, and I see it in other people now, is that you're learning something, like you learn something about point of view and how it works in prose fiction. And then you pick up a book, and if it doesn't do that, you just throw it aside. Because you're so focused on that one thing at one time. And it takes... And then when you're doing like criticism as well, in the way that I do, it's very easy to overanalyze, over-examine everything that's coming across your plate. And I'm sure I'm often guilty of that as well. But you kind of start to enjoy on a different level, because it's like my brother is a coder, very good coder, and he talks about the way that he can look at something on screen and he can see what the code is doing underneath. And you have that enjoyment when you're watching stories as well. So you can see what the act structure, how the scenes are being turned in a movie script, how they're bringing in significant thematic elements with different symbols that are happening, and having that conscious awareness at the same time is kind of can be an extra layer of enjoyment. But I guess for something like Rings of Power, there's also this issue of, I don't know what our average age is as a group, but it's probably we're probably all in our 40s, I guess. Probably all.
Yeah, I think you guys are. I'm pretty sure you guys are all pretty old. Yeah.
Yeah, Tristan's our young pup.
You're the Frodo Baggins of the group.
At 40 soon.
40 soon.
We're all the same age, guys.
And, I professionally spend all of my time thinking about sci-fi and fantasy and a few other things alongside, but that's my main thing. So that's my excuse for being a guy who's too old to really have this kind of level of obsession about a children's story. The Hobbit is definitely a children's story. Lord of the Rings is pretty much still a children's story. The Rings of Power should probably primarily appeal to 12-year-olds and family viewing. And yet there are millions, absolutely millions of guys and women as well, of course, with like an obsessive level of interest about these things still. And I'm guilty of that. But it's a very interesting question why that is. But in practical terms, it puts a lot of pressure on something like a Rings of Power television show. I still think Rings of Power was I feel it was like a derisory attempt to make Tolkien. Peter Jackson, I think, at least took it very seriously. A lot of time and energy was put in. And it did define the look, which then Rings of Power is trying to do. So... But the Lord of the Rings movies are still essentially for children. So what are we doing as grown-ups, putting all of this pressure on these stories to be storytelling for middle-aged men and young children at the same time? I don't really have an answer to that yet. I want to do some more thinking about it, because I think if you look on like the YouTube critique sphere at the moment, a lot of the anger and rage that drives that is looking for something in sci-fi and fantasy storytelling that it was never really designed to provide to the world.
Because there is a paradox of choice with every time you go into any of these, Disney Plus or Netflix or any of these content houses, there's a credibility problem for any new content. You go in there and you don't know whether you want to waste your time watching something that could be crud or it could be great. But as soon as you brand it with something that you know about, it gives it that instant credibility. And when you've got that paradox of choice, it really helps people make decisions and thereby get the views, and there goes the money. So that's it's tough. It's like a car brand, and you wouldn't necessarily buy a car from a fly-by-night car manufacturer. You don't know if it's going to be reliable. You don't know if it's going to be a nice drive. So
we just don't have time to watch it. Like the thing is, these brands are like, they're just an instant yes for most people. Like, I watch this brand, this brand, this brand, and this brand. Once I go through everything that's going on in those brands, I don't have time for anything else, right? Like, there's just too much.
But brands have to represent a
Franchise
certain set of values. Brand values are the core of brand marketing. And past life for me was all about building brands, basically. And, so you have the Marvel brand, which is really very much focused on kind of adolescent male viewers, early 20s male viewers, and then you publish She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, under that brand. And I found that show really funny. I came to it with an open mind. But, of course, it doesn't really fit the Marvel brand, particularly because it is kind of Sex and the City relocated to Marvel and Hulk characters. So to an extent, some of the anger directed at it is just confusion of people who have a certain expectation of what the Marvel brand will be. And it's like they've gone in to buy a Big Mac and they've been served up a salad instead. And they're just like, it's not what I ordered. It might be better. I don't know. It's just not what I ordered.
Salads are good too, but I thought it'd be a Big Mac.
Exactly. Yeah. I wanted some cheese and salt.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you for joining us again. It was a real pleasure talking to you. It's
been great. I'm going to head off and get some breakfast now, actually. It's
perfect.
Morning for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I really appreciate it, Damien.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Damien.
Good to chat
Very
with you.
much. We'll connect again in the future for sure.
I'll look forward to hearing this when it pops up in my podcast stream.
Fantastic.
You're one of my regular listeners.
Awesome.
That means a lot. That's great.
Cool.
All right. Have a good morning. Enjoy your breakfast.
You too. Bye.
Take it easy. Damien. Yeah.
Thank you, Damien, for joining us once again. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. We really appreciate you. Please watch episodes coming out in the weeks to come. We've got a lot going on. All right. Until next time.